Good evening. Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. I'm Steve Burgess, and I'm broadcasting from Utah.
And I'm David Sabine, broadcasting from Ontario. Find us, please, at fundamentalfreedoms.org. You can also find us, hopefully, at your favorite platforms. We are currently at Facebook, YouTube, and we're starting to use Rumble, so find us there. We're also at locals.com. Join us.
We believe that good society is based on good conversation. It's okay to come to a conversation not ready to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it's okay to have respect for people that you disagree with.
Steve and I have agreed on two basic guidelines for all of our conversations together and with guests. The first guideline is that we try to avoid undefined they statements. So if we ever use the word they, we try to be very clear about who that is. And also we try to avoid undefined we statements. So regardless of our affiliations or our memberships, we are individuals. We speak as an individual.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. This is a in conversation session, so David and I will be talking about a couple of different subjects, and you're welcome to make comments on Facebook or at Locals, and we'll try and keep an eye for those and involve you if we can.
That's new for us, by the way, so please feel free to make comments at Facebook or at Locals. So there's a live chat at Locals, and of course, Facebook supports that as well. It's pretty busy for us here with all the tech, so I can't promise that we're paying attention to the chats, but we'll try, and we'll get used to it, and we'll get better at that as time goes on and as we do more of these shows. And Steve, it is Wednesday. We're in February. Can you believe 1/12 of 2021 is now past?
Don't put it that way.
Okay, so I wrote to Steve the other day and I said, hey, I think we should go online and have a conversation about this survey that was published recently in Canada. And I'm going to bring it up on screen here, and we intend to go through the survey questions and some of the responses, which I think I was a bit shocked actually to read how Canadians fall on some of these particular issues, and I hope, Steve, you can help me find some optimism in it somewhere. Shall we dig in, or is there anything else you want to start with?
No, let's jump in.
Okay, so the way this will work is I'm going to bring this up on screen. And what I have here, let me get to the first page. So this is the February Omnibus 2021 National Study by Campaign Research. This is available online. Oh, I should have put the URL in the description, and I'll do that later. But it's publicly available. And apparently 2,413 respondents were surveyed across Canada and asked a number of these questions. And Steve and I are going to go through this page by page and see if we find anything of use in it and see what we can learn from it. Steve, I hope you can see it. And if you would please navigate for me, I'll drive the bus, but you navigate. You tell me which page you want to go to and
Okay,
where
well,
you want to dig in.
Let's jump in. Let's go to that first page. I mean, the first question they asked is just generally concern about contracting COVID-19. This is broken down by age and gender. So it looks like, I mean, across the ages, somewhat concerned and very concerned make up the vast majority of those statistics, which I don't find particularly surprising. I mean, I think somewhat concerned. It makes sense that more people are somewhat than very concerned. I think there's a lot of people who are living their lives and not particularly, freaked out about COVID from day to day.
Yeah, and so by the way, you'll notice the structure of this survey. this is question 1, and what we're seeing is a chart showing how the genders fall on this particular question. But the next page is the same Q1 question. How concerned are you about contracting COVID-19? But this time they're describing, or the chart shows how people responded across Canada, so in various regions across Canada. And then there's another page here about how people vote and how they respond to this particular question. So one thing that's important to know, Steve, is that later on you'll see in this survey that people were asked the question, if there were an election today, which party would you vote for? And then based on that response, these charts are then produced for every question of the survey. This is what they call the ballot test.
Let's go back one slide and look at that geographical breakdown across Canada.
Sure.
So, I mean, if you kind of just juxtapose Saskatchewan to Manitoba, which surprises me. I mean, they're geographically close. Manitoba, from what the little bit that I've read about what's going on there, Manitoba seems like they have some of the strictest lockdown. Is that fair to say, or is that not accurate?
They were very strict and quite early. I would say that their policies aren't as strict as we saw in in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, but they were later to the game. So when Manitoba did impose really strict lockdowns, it was really draconian.
That's interesting, because if you look, they have basically the biggest disparity between very concerned and somewhat concerned, meaning, I mean, comparatively, the population there seems more laissez-faire about whether or not they're going to contract COVID versus Saskatchewan next door, which there's just as many people who are very concerned as there are who are moderately concerned.
Yeah, it's
that
still
kind of surprises
80%
me. I would have thought that the higher population densities, British Columbia or Ontario, would have been, I guess, but British Columbia is kind of laissez-faire, if you want to call it that. Ontario is a little more, but Saskatchewan has by far the highest percentage. Well, not by far, but I mean higher than Ontario.
I can't explain that exactly. One thing I was curious to know is how are these respondents exposed to information about COVID? So, for example, do more people in Saskatchewan watch mainstream media than in Alberta? Where, like, does that possibly explain why in Alberta we see the highest, well, not quite the highest, but let's say above average across Canada, people that are not as concerned or not at all concerned about contracting COVID-19?
Well, certainly not at all concerned. That's a big spike in Alberta. That's noticeably higher.
Yeah.
So, which makes sense, but I would have thought Saskatchewan would have followed suit a little bit there. But of course, you have 2,400 respondents. It can be skewed a little bit, especially when you start breaking it down into 10 or 12 subgroups and things. But
yeah.
So this is Canada as a whole on the left, and then broken down by not necessarily party affiliation, but just based on the question, who would you vote for if you were voting today?
Yeah, that's right. And there were a number of people that... So one of the things I find difficult about this chart is we don't know how many people fall in each of these categories. So was this, out of 2,400 people, was this 2,000 people, and then the rest were spread across the others, or the opposite, right? Was it... Did 2,000 people refuse to indicate their vote, and the other 400 are then spread across these charts? But nonetheless, people who are certainly decided about their vote appear to differ on this question to some degree. We're going to see real differences in some of the future, in some of the next questions that we look at. But, look at this. The Liberal Party voters are the highest in terms of, so 38% say they were very concerned about contracting COVID-19. Any theories?
I mean, I don't know. I hate to generalize and feel like it falls on party lines, but it seems to it, and I don't know if that's because if you're more right-leaning party, it's not as fashionable to be as concerned about COVID. What party is that with the high red spike there?
This one here is another party or refused to say.
Interesting. So the people that are most most likely to say I'm not concerned about COVID at all are also hesitant or not willing to claim a party affiliation or a party leaning.
Right.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And again, we don't know the percentages.
The number breakdown, right.
Yeah. So let's not read too much into that, and maybe we'll
Yeah,
come back to
yeah.
that as we. So that was question number 1. Question 2, please choose the option that mostly aligns with your current view. Has the government done a good job or bad job of provincial government dealing with pandemic? So these were the options that people could select from. I could read just the summary at the top, which indicates that 61% of the voters across Canada believe that their provincial government has done a good job, while 36% believe their provincial government has done a bad job. Older voters give government higher marks, generally. Also, we're looking at charts here that show the results across genders, which is, by the way, I want to just claim, I want to call this out, that they're using the word gender here, and then they're using the sex here, male and female. So I don't know what to make of that, whether it matters or not. But females, 55 and older, all 52% of them, the highest graph here, selected that my provincial government has done a good job, and I feel that we need the new restrictions and enforcement to remain in place for January and into February at least. Wow.
Yeah. So more aligned along age rather than sex, really. It's pretty gender-wise, it's about the same, but age-wise, there's a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation here. Now, the same question asked across Canada, we can see Atlantic Canada with a huge spike there. 77% of the people believe that their provincial government has done a good job, and 55% of Alberta voters think that their provincial has done a good job.
It's interesting. So the politics in Atlantic Canada fall more along the lines of Middle Eastern Canada, rather than the kind of Wild West politics of Alberta, Saskatchewan.
It seems that way, yeah. The further west you go, it seems the more people are less concerned about contracting COVID and less interested in government restrictions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
I'm painting.
It's a pretty broad brush, but yeah.
The same set of questions here across party affiliation. Wow. So it says here 61% of Liberal Party voters and 71% of Conservative voters and 60% of Green Party voters believe that their provincial governments have done a good job. NDP voters are evenly split 50-50 on the question. Also high support from the Bloc Québécois voters.
Yeah. So far this is really, those are fairly overwhelming statistics when you talk about 60s and 70s, in a telephone poll like this, I mean, Canadians are generally happy with how the government and provincial governments have responded to COVID and what they've done as far as mitigation, it looks like.
But is it because the Canadian government has been pumping money into the system and staving off any actual repercussions? You know, the pandemic hasn't yet affected on a personal level most Canadians.
Right.
It's affected such a small portion, and in terms of health, but also in terms of finances, which is bizarre to say because people right across the country are unemployed, businesses are shutting down daily, and like it's certainly affecting people. But how is it that right across Canada, you know, if we draw a line down here, the 61% of the respondents said that their governments are doing a good job. I wonder how they could think that when their neighbors are unemployed and foreclosing on their house and their local businesses are all shutting down. And like, are we just staving off some of the impacts and people aren't yet confronted with those impacts? Or
It's kind of surprising, like what poll can you do and get 60 to 70% of people saying government's doing a good job of anything?
right, weird. Eh?
Like and so I don't know if it's just or Canadians are nice, apparently. That's what I've heard. And
This
so
is
maybe they're
interesting,
just maybe it's just we feel like the government's doing the best that they can, you know. And then you have that another party and just complete opposite, obviously.
Yeah.
And
So
so that's the you know, I don't think they've done a good job and they need to just stay out of it.
yeah, like I don't support any of the current parties, and the current parties have done a bad job. You
Yeah.
know, that's what I read here, that there are a number of people in this category, or that refused to say who they would vote for, and they too are
So,
not so happy with
but
the
David,
government
they
response.
professed, I mean, so the refuse, because if you just said, well, I'm not affiliated with a party or I'm undecided about what party I'm going to vote for, but when you say another party, that's they named a specific party that's not on this list then.
Well, I wonder, yeah, like, so which parties aren't on this list? And we're talking about, in this case, the provincial government, okay? So each province has their own version of a libertarian party. Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Quebec have separatist parties. You know, maybe for the sake of being of simplifying the chart, they're just grouping all those
Right.
lesser known parties. Yeah.
So maybe that explains part of the chart. People who are disenfranchised with the popular parties and kind of the government as it is are also not happy with what government's done, which I guess makes some sense.
Makes
But
some sense.
again, hard to read a lot into that without knowing how those actual numbers break down and how many people are being represented there. But
So we're moving on to the third question, which is which of these statements is closer to your own view? So the statements are below here. There's the blue, orange, and gray. So some people say we must continue to implement all possible restrictions to slow the spread of COVID-19 because that is the most important thing that we need to do right now. And that there seems to be high support for that across all age groups. And
yeah,
the orange here is other people say that implementing these restrictions is having more a negative impact on people than COVID-19 is. They point to people's economic situations, physical condition, psychological condition, other hardships as reasons for not continuing the restrictions. I'm clearly in that, knows that if you've ever watched even a few minutes of past broadcasts of ours. I was hoping that would be a larger proportion, but it's not.
yeah.
So that's why, Steve, I think I'm really unable to be optimistic about the next questions that we see, okay? Because the next questions talk about restrictions. And, how comfortable are you that your fellow Canadians will be separated, that their families will be separated and to quarantine camps against their will? Or how comfortable are you that vaccines are mandatory? Or how comfortable are you that people should be fined or put in prison for not wearing a mask? And so let's just keep this slide in mind, where we have literally 70, 73%, 67% support for all possible restrictions to slow the spread, because that is the most important thing that we need to do right now. Like, that's urgent language.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on. That question, regionally, again, very high support right across the country.
Yep.
In terms of party affiliation,
Just that spike in another party again,
yeah,
but kind of paints the same story.
yeah. The best balance here would be found in the Conservative Party voters.
Yep.
I think that's true of my experience. This is a group that's very diverse ideas, very willing to have debate, and well, I don't want to make too many other conclusions about that slide, but let's move on.
Yeah.
All right, so here we get into some of the restrictions. And by the way, I think it's interesting to note, why would a government finance a survey like this if not to figure out how far can they push these restrictions and still get voted in the next election? Okay?
Yeah.
Am I being
So,
cynical?
well, this is encouraging at least. I mean, it's discouraging that there's any blue bars here at all, but I mean, at least strongly oppose. I mean, most Canadians are still saying, or a third at least or more are saying, no, government can't enter our homes without a warrant, even in this circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. I am
But-
really happy to see very little support. Well, I can't say very little. Less support for this authority.
Yeah.
Obviously, this spike here is interesting. These are males of father age. I don't know if that makes a difference, but
Yeah.
I would strongly oppose a officer entering our home without warrant.
Yeah.
Move on.
Yes. Yeah.
The same question here. The opposition is highest in Ontario and Alberta and lowest in Quebec. Support for this type of activity is highest in Quebec and surprisingly in Saskatchewan. Are you surprised by that?
I'm consistently surprised in these Saskatchewan statistics, because it seems like they would fall more in line with Alberta. I mean, geographically, population-wise, they're even more sparsely populated than Alberta or Manitoba. I mean, maybe is there something going on in Saskatchewan the night that they made these phone calls? Maybe there's only 3 or 4 respondents.
Yeah. Well, that could be. Hey, I'm interested to go back to this age breakdown here. Where do we see the highest support? I guess it's the older folks. It's the males and females older than 55.
Which falls in line with, they were the ones most concerned about contracting and most supportive of whatever measures necessary. Which, I mean, fundamentally, that makes sense. They're most at risk. It's 50 to 70, and then 70 plus especially are the people that are most at risk if they do get COVID.
So this is about entering the home without warrant to enforce compliance with COVID restrictions. I would love to know, like, unfortunately, there's not a lot of nuance in these questions, but I would love to know those same people. So if we were talking to a male or a female age 55 or higher, and we ask this question, and then they express support for this, or more support than the other age groups, and then we were to ask them, okay, so you support police being able to enter the home without a warrant, and what if someone refuses? What should be the consequence of that?
I mean, if force is force, and so if you're saying
Right.
I'm okay with somebody entering a home without a warrant, then I'm okay for that person to get arrested. I'm okay for that person to get detained. I'm okay for that person to get hurt,
Shot.
killed ultimately, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if they're going to keep resisting, and the officers or whatever
Yeah.
feel like they have a valid reason to be there, and you're resisting, then I mean, if you're okay with them entering without a warrant, then you're okay with them going to whatever degree necessary, I would think.
Yeah, and like, for example, it can snowball. And I would love if there's someone watching or someone who knows a police officer in Canada. But my understanding of this scenario would be an officer shows up and knocks on the door, and they say, we want to enter your home. And if you refuse that, they're no longer there to check your COVID restrictions and your compliance with that. They are now there, and as you are resisting their order, right? You're obstructing justice, or you're like, it could quickly get out of hand and escalate to violence, force, the use of force. So I would love to know, like, if you're talking to someone asking them this question, you think the officers should be able to enter homes without a warrant? Okay, but is that by request, or would you agree that they should be able to, like, tear the door down and
Well,
go in by
entering
force?
without a warrant is entering without a
Exactly.
warrant. I mean,
Yeah, but I don't know that people associate the use of force, such as a police officer is authorized, with, this more polite version of, like, maybe people have this idea that officers, they come and they knock on the door and they ask you how you're doing, and we're just here for everyone's safety, and, could you tell us if you have any guests in the home? And we'll trust your answer because we're nice people. Or do people, when asked this question in the survey, match the question with the fact that officers have authorization to use force when necessary?
well, and I mean, it goes. And you're right. Maybe people don't understand the nuances of the question, but for me, entering a home without a warrant automatically means against my will.
Okay, but we're gonna,
Because
yeah, carry
because
on.
if they if they don't have a warrant, then I can voluntarily let anybody I want in my home, especially a police officer who comes and asks nicely, can we come and take a look around? Sure, that would be great. I would be fine with me. Or no, well, we don't need a warrant, and so we're coming in anyway.
Right.
One thing that this brings me to, David, is so as I was doing a little bit of research on the recent travel restrictions and all
Yeah.
of that hit last week or whatever it was, I was reading through it and talking about, you have to fly into these 4 airports, and as soon as you touch ground, you show
Yeah.
us your negative test. And
Yeah.
despite the negative test, you will now get another test, and we will essentially detain you
Yes.
in a hotel of the government's choosing at
Yes.
your expense,
Without
and
telling your
you
family
won't be
members
allowed
where we've
out.
taken you.
Yeah, you'll pay for your food, which we will bring you. You'll pay for the security and the security you're paying for is to keep you restricted to the room that you're paying for. And as I read through that, I thought, where is the authority? Like, what legislation or what act gives them authority to do this? Because some of this stuff seems so far across the line. And as I read through that, if you go to the Canada.ca gov website,
Mm-hmm.
it talks about the authorities being pulled from the Quarantine Act of 2005, which was
Right.
updated. I don't know what changes were made in February or March of 2020, so right at the beginning of the pandemic. But the act, I went in and read through a bunch of the act, and it basically says, warrants aren't necessary. If somebody is I can't remember, there's a quarantine officer and a quarantine
Mm-hmm.
worker, maybe. And so the officer actually has some authority to detain and question people. But a quarantine worker, for any type of suspicion, can call police, and
Mm-hmm.
police can detain people without warrants, can enter homes without warrants. And as I read through it, I thought,
But hold on. On
yeah,
suspicion of you're carrying a dangerous virus,
suspicion of
and
you carrying a
you're
dangerous
spreading,
virus,
you're
but also,
showing.
yeah, a whole list of just not complying with the quarantine rules,
Oh gosh.
or being cooperative with the quarantine
Okay.
process.
Well, let's
And
continue.
so,
We could find out how many Canadians agree that that should be the case, because those are related. Like what you're describing here is going to show up in some of the next questions.
yeah, and agree or not, it's a law. And
Yeah.
if they decide to apply, see, when I read the Quarantine Act of 2005,
Mm.
what I was what I was picturing in my head as I read that was an Ebola outbreak in
Yeah.
Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where it's
Right.
like, hey, we cannot let this terribly mortal disease out of this restricted geographic area. And we've got
Yeah.
to restrict travel. Like it or not, we're coming into your home to see if you have symptoms. Um, we're giving you
Mm-hmm.
antidotes. We're doing whatever we need to make sure that this thing doesn't spread beyond certain boundaries. And that, for a disease um, that's very identifiable, very deadly. I mean, people talk about COVID being deadly, with a 0.6 to 0.8% mortality or whatever. But I mean, other diseases that are like, 30 or 40% mortality. Like, you get
Yeah.
this thing, it's a coin toss whether or not you're going to survive. And
Yeah.
it's melting your organs and over the period of days. And I mean, we've all seen those movies, Outbreak and whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sitting there reading it and wincing and thinking, this is so anti-liberty and so anti-personal choice. But I'm not sure that I could totally disagree in a confined geographical, very short-term kind of emergency situation. But then I'm thinking,
But we ought to
yeah,
agree though on some manner of severity. Like like you said, if this is like what's the R number for
right.
Ebola, or what's the fatality rate of such a disease, and like government ought to have to prove that this thing they're dealing with is above those thresholds. But they've not proven that in this case, and COVID-19 is nowhere near that severity. And by the way, my government is desperately trying to make it illegal for me to say the words, COVID is like a bad flu. Quote, end quote, that phrase will soon be, like it's actually quoted in literature that I saw today related to, what is it, Bill C-10 or Bill C-11, where the heritage minister in this country is trying to define hate speech, and they're trying to define disinformation and misinformation and make such things illegal. And that's one of those phrases that they consider misinformation. And so Like,
See, and it's a matter of perspective, right? How far are you zoomed out? How much of the spectrum are you taking in? If you're talking about seasonal flu viruses, then comparing COVID-19 to the common flu or to a common cold is I would say it is misinformation. It is certainly not the common cold. It is much more viral, much more contagious, much more deadly. I mean, and those numbers have played out. It is not the common cold. But let's let's zoom out further and take a look at the spectrum of possible diseases and include things like Ebola and hantavirus and HIV and just an entire spectrum of diseases and sicknesses. Well, now it is a lot more like the common cold. It is a flu virus. It's a coronavirus. It's a seasonal virus, and
yeah.
it's quite a bit more severe than most of them that we've dealt with over the last decades. But
But its variants are likely not to be, this isn't going to remain as dangerous or as fatal as it is right now.
no, it's not anthrax.
Right, right.
Where
So,
this
so that's right.
substance
So
or
let's
this,
get back to this
yeah.
point where the government has written themselves some authority to react in cases like anthrax or Ebola, but they're using it today where this particular virus has such an incredible recovery rate. We've got good treatments, and there doesn't seem to be a reason to, for example, take a Canadian citizen when they arrive at an airport to an unknown location without telling their family members where they've gone, and then holding them there until they have a negative test result, and then making them pay for it. And like, it's just, let's move on. There's some of these questions are going to, we're going to return to this theme, Steve. So,
Okay.
because I'm stressed out a little bit. So this page shows the ballot test. And again, we're seeing very low support for granting authority to the police to enter a home without a warrant in people who either did not indicate their party affiliation or those that are undecided, but also among, look at this is interesting, among the NDP and the Conservative Party members and the Green Party members. So what's going on there? Why would the Green Party and the NDP Party be in agreement with Conservative voters that they strongly oppose police being authorized to enter homes without warrants? Any theories?
Because it's wrong. I mean, in a free society, it's just fundamentally a problem, And so I mean, it's good that a lot of people recognize that, regardless of party affiliation or politics.
I have a different theory.
Okay.
I think what they have in common is none of those voters want police to misuse their authority. These folks here are generally outspoken about police brutality, and these folks here are generally in favor of law and order. So if we're going to use police, we need to do that within the confines of existing law and with due process, and so on. And I think that these voters here don't trust that police work within due process and within existing law.
So some mistrust in just for different reasons, or yeah, that may be true.
Moving on, if we see the next question, police should be able to establish checkpoints. This one is related to vehicle checkpoints. The next question, I think, is related to pedestrian checkpoints. So these are related. 52% of Canadian voters support police establishing vehicular checkpoints, and 45% oppose. This is interesting.
There's a lot less consensus there.
Yeah, a lot more balance. Why is that, I wonder? I wonder if we can learn anything from the regions, any regional differences. Atlantic Canada and Quebec have high support for this activity. Not surprising, the West does not.
Yep. Hmm.
Hmm.
So still some regional differences, but on a whole, fairly
Yeah.
balanced on that question.
Ballot test. Um, you know what? We might learn the ballot test. We might learn later how many people said they refused to answer. Is this what I'm looking at? The decided federal ballot test, age and gender. Let's just have a look. This might give us some context. So, a huge number of people said they were undecided. That's the yellow. And gray is a vote for some other party. So 4%, 2%, 1%.
So that is okay. So
So
that's a
people,
pretty underrepresented minority there of respondents.
yeah, but the undecided group, that is significant for
Yep.
sure.
Okay.
I would say that's even more significant than the Bloc and Green Party, some of the numbers we're seeing there. Okay, back up
Yeah.
to where we were. That was helpful context. Oh, that's foreshadowing. Okay, checkpoints. We're back to vehicular checkpoints. Atlantic Canada, the ballot test. This is where we were. So group that are undecided, pretty even spread there.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised by what I'm seeing here, except maybe this. I don't understand the Bloc. I clearly don't understand the Bloc, and voters, people who indicate that they vote for the Bloc.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. Their spike there with agreeing with vehicular checkpoints. Hmm.
Yeah. And the Liberal Party. I mean, this is also significant.
Yeah.
Well, and the Green Party for that matter, I guess.
Yeah. Hmm.
Pedestrian checkpoints. 51% oppose and 46% support the police being able to establish pedestrian checkpoints to enforce COVID. What is a pedestrian checkpoint? I don't know that I've ever seen one.
Well, I mean, generally it sounds like, are you okay with them coming and finding you in your homes? And the
No, no,
consensus is no.
this is
And then
about
are you
outside your
okay
home.
with them? Right. But then the second part, are you okay with them finding you in your vehicle? And then what about just contacting you or stopping you randomly on the street as you're walking along? And that would be
Like
pedestrian
outside of a
in my mind.
shopping mall.
Or yeah, at some public place. And
Yeah.
so our consensus on in your home was fairly strongly against. I mean, there was still a contingent of like people that are okay with that. Vehicles was fairly even, and then as a pedestrian, we see this shift a little bit to opposed again.
Yeah. That's good to see, frankly, in my opinion. I would vote that I'm strongly opposed to this.
Why would if the point, I mean, if the point is to worry about COVID restrictions, isn't somebody inside of a sealed vehicle by themselves on their way from somewhere to somewhere? Isn't that more likely less of an issue than someone who's gathered at a mall or gathered at some public venue?
No, I think maybe the common assumption is that you've got a bunch of 21-year-olds out in a car partying on a Saturday night and they're driving around, and we should stop that activity. Maybe we should set up a checkpoint and catch
No,
the
I have my
media,
own
so to
opinions
speak.
about it, but it doesn't make sense. The overall respondents here, like, why is a
I'm not
car
expressing my opinion, by the way, just to be clear.
right? No, I know, but I'm saying why is a car more dangerous than somebody walking around? Just
Yeah, I don't
interesting.
know. I don't know. Regional differences. Again, Atlantic Canada seems to be a little more protectionist than
Yep.
Western Canada, with something weird going on in Saskatchewan again. Uh, Liberal Party voters are more supportive than the others, but Bloc voters strongly support the police establishing pedestrian checkpoints.
I'm going to start
Let's just
dismissing.
remind ourselves that this is such a small portion
Yeah,
of
the,
this respondents that we can't read too much into that.
there some apparently people who have access to Fox News on their cable or something like that. It's just a small group.
Yeah, it's a small group. The, uh, the Canadian government hasn't yet censored all of that material coming in across the border. 64% of Canadian voters are opposed to police being authorized to separate family members to reduce or eliminate the risk of COVID spread. Opposition is high among all ages, males and females. I'm glad that opposition is high, but what is going on here? How could there be possibly that high?
Hey, you sort of, when you were 20 years old, how big a deal would it have been to separate from your parents
Yeah, maybe.
or,
I hope
or
you're
your
right. I hope
siblings?
that's. Oh, this is the actual question, by the way, that was asked. So, do you support or oppose police and health officials being authorized to separate family members at their discretion by removing people from homes and housing them somewhere else to reduce or eliminate the risk of COVID spread?
Oh, that is such a, oh,
At whose
why do we?
discretion? Like, I read this as at the police discretion. Yes?
Yes, at their discretion. Yeah, that's what I understand.
Would that be clear, I hope, to everybody asked the question?
This is a great example of why. I mean, I'm not going to say that young adults shouldn't be allowed to vote, but so many of them, so little life experience and so little perspective on things. For 1 in 5 of those people to
Mm-hmm.
say, I strongly agree that police should be able to come into somebody's home and separate out family members at their discretion if they think it will help fight COVID.
Yeah, without due process, without warrant, without
And almost,
identifying
yeah.
the charge, without a jury, you know, crazy.
I mean, even the
By
people
force,
in the
with
older
lethal
age
force.
categories who were, very concerned about contracting COVID, very supportive of kind of tougher or more invasive government measures or policing to help, with the mitigation efforts, even them understand that you don't want to turn society under any circumstances into a place where government can walk into your house and take children and split up families simply because they feel like it, essentially. I mean, that's what the question is. So,
Yeah,
man, these
yeah. Like
poor
this
20
is
somethings.
how many of these same respondents would have been angrily tweeting for the past 3 years about ICE, separating children from their families at the border. And
Right.
here in Canada, we've got 23 plus 19% of males age 18 to 34 who agree that police at their discretion, with no jury involved, no trial involved, separate the family members.
What? Look at the difference between males and females on that. Hey,
Yeah.
I apologize, females under the age of 34. I disparaged you and lumped you in. It's clearly the guys. What
Yeah.
is what is up with that?
But look at the shift that happens, as people are 35, males are older than 35. There seems to be a shift in thinking there.
That's that's fascinating and disturbing. Hmm.
Okay, moving on, because that's the gender breakdown on that question, but here are the um, regional breakdowns. Atlantic Canada, a little greater support, it seems, a little heavier on that end. But other than that, we seem to have
Yeah,
widespread disagreement that police should have this authority.
good.
Good, yeah, good. But it is frightening, actually, that there still is
There's a
this
chunk.
group,
Yep.
that strongly support it. You know,
Yeah.
wow. This was in the news actually when I saw this tweeted. Uh, I think what caught my eye initially was the high degree of Liberal Party voters who support strongly and or somewhat support this authority. So that's
Yep.
higher among the Liberal Party voters than any of the other parties.
Hmm.
Interesting. I wonder why that is. Like, so if by the way you've paid attention to mainstream news media in Canada for the past few weeks, CBC certainly has been working hard to kind of prime Canadians for this. I've noticed it less amongst Global and CTV, but I have noticed it in the Toronto Star as well, where they'll run little articles about under what conditions this would be necessary, and should we be concerned? And then the conclusion of the article is, no, we shouldn't. Certainly, our government will do the right thing and use their discretion and so forth. So, if you're paying attention to that kind of news media, which I presume these people are, because it's largely paid for by the Liberal Party of Canada with all the subsidies and bailout money and such. It's clearly directed at those voters, and that's no secret. Justin Trudeau himself brags about the fact that he, what did he say in a fundraiser a year and a half ago or 3 years ago? He said, people are surprised at how we get such great headlines. Well, there's no secret. We bought those headlines. You don't get great headlines like these without. And he went on and bragged about how his subsidies are directed at Canadian broadcasters, and that is paying off. Sorry for the little bird walk there on that topic, but I think that explains why these people who indicated that they would vote for the Liberal Party of Canada also support this policy idea, and it's largely because they're exposed to that in their news media.
Yeah. Hmm. Still don't. Yeah, it's still a good general curve there, I would say.
So you're not worried about that like I am?
No, I understand your point, but I mean it's not, the numbers aren't hugely different, but they're measurable. I can see what you're saying.
Listen to this
So
question here. Oh, you want to carry on? Sorry.
no. So I was just looking. So this is now talking about isolation.
Yeah, so the question, let me read it. Oh my gosh. Do you support or oppose the establishment of COVID-19 isolation centers where people who are found in breach of COVID-19 related emergency measures could be taken to protect themselves and others from COVID-19 for the duration of the pandemic? For the duration of the pandemic? What is being asked here? Are we literally asking people, are you comfortable that our government might round up your citizens and hold them in protective custody until the end of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's interesting what they say there. While people, because I'm like, wait, why are we opposite? How is this question different than, are you okay with them separating families? And the difference is, well, yeah, we would never want families separated, and we don't necessarily want people stopped on the street, and we certainly don't want them coming into our homes. But if somebody's not playing ball with the restrictions,
Yeah.
send them down the river. I mean,
Wow. Like,
that's what this says, is just like, yeah, if somebody's going to flout the rules, oh,
yeah.
no, there's no punishment too severe for somebody who's not going to follow the rules.
Yeah. And it's an extreme percentage here. 58%.
Yeah.
Right across the board.
Yeah.
I thank these folks and this group here, but I'm worried by that. The next slide is the same question, but now we're looking at the regional differences. We're seeing again high support in every region. Not much opposition to this. Not nearly enough opposition to this, in my opinion.
Manitoba pretty much has, well, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia all have quite a, I mean, so again, those regional differences.
I think this is the first time we've seen a pretty high percentage of people that said, I don't know and I'm unsure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That could be a factor in, because again, the law of small numbers might be at play here. How many people in Saskatchewan were asked these questions, and of that small number, are we just seeing some weird breakdown here?
We'll have to have a statistician on
Yeah.
some point, because how can you
Yeah.
take 2,400 respondents and get down to, like, what did they estimate, a 2.3% margin of error?
Yeah, yeah, it seems
I'm
sketchy,
like,
doesn't it?
how is that possible? Maybe it
Yeah.
is. I mean, statistically or numerically, I mean, that's the way it works, but it just seems like such a
Yeah.
small swath of people, you know?
Here's the
But
same question across across party affiliations, and I do not understand the bloc voters. I just don't.
yeah,
What's going on there? But again, we're very high in the NDP, Green Party, very high support, and high support in the Liberal Party voters.
yeah.
And again, I wonder, like, what nuance are we missing? Do you support or oppose the establishment of isolation centers where people who are found in breach of the related emergency measures could be taken? Okay, they will be taken, they could be, whose discretion, for how long? Would they be taken as a family? Would they be taken and separated from their family? Like, maybe there's just not enough detail in the question that people didn't know how to answer it, or they I don't know, they clearly had high degrees of support for the idea. Do you want to move on, or do you want to say more to that?
No, it's. I think it's the punitive nature. It's the idea of it's one thing for the general population, but if somebody's breaking the rules, then we have very little patience for that.
Yeah, okay, again, yeah, you're right. But so if you're found in breach, how are you found? Are you found because you're symptomatic and sneezing on everybody? You're in a shopping center, and
You quarantine for 9 days instead of 10 days, or you
right.
didn't go immediately to quarantine, or you, yeah.
Right.
attended the wrong event, or you weren't wearing a mask, or I mean, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
things that could be that would
Or
put you in breach.
you're with your 12-year-old daughter, and you're wearing a mask, but she isn't.
Yeah.
Does she get taken? Are we all okay with that? Because apparently, gosh, do the math here. 67% of Liberal Party voters are okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe they would say, no, 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 no. Well, 12-year-olds, nah, I'm not okay with that. But if you're able-bodied and 28 and you should know better, and you're just flouting the rules, well, then yeah, I'm okay if you get rounded up and taken to a concentration camp till the end of the pandemic. That
And
phrase, I wonder,
and I'm gonna
for
call
the
you out.
duration.
I'm gonna call you out. It's not a
Okay.
concentration camp. It's an isolation center. I mean, and
If you're not allowed to leave, like what is the difference in your mind? Why would you? I
well,
mean, I know
concentration
it's an
camp,
unpopular
obviously,
term.
concentration camp. I mean, the most common reference to that is World War II, and question is not, are you okay with people being rounded up and killed? I mean, but
No,
there's
in
that.
Canada,
There,
we did this in, was it uh, in British Columbia, we had concentration camps for Japanese in the middle of the 20th century.
mm-hmm.
This isn't a concept that is new or unknown in Canada. We have those skeletons in our closet too, and it didn't result in mass deaths and so forth, at least not mass. I mean, there were fatalities, and there were deaths, and there was starvation, and there was all of that. And I'm not suggesting it's going to go that far, but
Right.
we
But I mean, but
we can't
the
not apply. Like we can't say that an isolation center is somehow unlike a concentration camp. What's the difference?
well, it's not like a World War II Nazi concentration camp, you wouldn't think,
I'll give you
but
that.
but
But it's
it
surrounded
could.
by fences. It's
But I mean,
surrounded by guards. You're not
yeah,
allowed to leave.
yep,
Your family members aren't allowed in. People are concentrated there for a very specific
yeah,
purpose. In this case, under the guise of quarantine.
yep. But
They're
I,
fed a very specific diet.
yeah,
This is coming out in the news, by the way. Like we're seeing now photos of people from these quarantine hotels, they're called, and we're seeing the meals they're given. And like it's crazy what's happening in this country right now.
yeah. The pictures that I saw wouldn't make me excited about paying $2,000 for 3 days accommodations if those were my meals.
No,
They
no.
didn't seem like 5-star meals. But that aside, I just want to say, and I know that I'm maybe Pollyannish in my approach to humanity and my faith in humanity, but what I see happening here as we go through these slides is
Mm-hmm.
Canadians that want to be team players. And
Mm-hmm.
I disagree quite a bit with some of the arguments and some of the statistics that we're seeing here. I feel like people aren't thinking completely through. They're not following something to its logical conclusion and say, well, that's fine, but how
Mm-hmm.
does that creep in? That's a good outcome or a sensible solution in your opinion, but how does the precedent that gets set and the
Mm-hmm.
legislation that gets enacted, how does
Mm-hmm.
that turn into a problem down the line? And I see people reacting from, I want this pandemic to be over. I trust my government, and to some extent,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm trusting the media to tell me good
Mm-hmm.
information about it. And I want to be on the winning team. I want to be a team player. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
really frustrated with people who aren't willing to be team players and who would flout the rules and work counter to trying to fix this problem. And that's what I see. And so it's not a lack of empathy. It's not a lack of compassion. It's not a lack of goodwill. It, I think, is a lack of critical thinking. And that sounds rude,
No,
but I
no,
think that's true.
I think you've
It's
nailed it, actually. You've just
going
laid
through
out.
these questions and saying, well, wait a minute, what could that lead to? I'm strongly in agreement with that. No, I'm not. I don't know about, I think they're more knee-jerk responses from the standpoint of, yeah, heck yeah, I want this over, and
Yeah,
I'm going to get on board with what we got to do to get rid of it.
I think you've just laid out a very fair, charitable perspective, and you're probably right. And I'm looking at these, I think, a little more cynical than what you've just described. And for example, I can see the trajectory of some of these policies and where it goes, and where it could easily go, given and like I was in a conversation not long ago with someone, and I think I asked them, have you ever heard of a government? When was the last time you saw a government give up some control? And they couldn't answer. Obviously, they kind of laughed at the question, because it's obvious that once the net has been cast, there's no coming back from that until some other major political event happens, and then there's a retraction of authority or something like that. But in this case, again, we're talking about government reactions to a virus with a 99.7% recovery rate in the vast majority of the population, with reasonable treatment plans, and we know where the risks are. Like the question here is not. I'm frustrated a bit that this survey does not have a question like, "Hey, do you think that we should very carefully wrap long-term care centers and other facilities where elderly congregate and operate in reasonable protections, so that we can get people back to running their businesses and get back to employment?" And like, that question doesn't exist in this survey, unfortunately, at least not asked in that way. And I'm frustrated by that, because I would love to know that answer. But shall we move on?
Yeah.
So this is the cell phone tracking question. Do you support or oppose the government compelling cell phone companies to provide all individual location data on users for the purpose of enforcing compliance with COVID-19 emergency measures? Steve, here's another question where I know for a fact that once a government gets access to that data, and that data is made available by companies to the government, they're never giving that up for no reason whatsoever. The Patriot Act, enacted 19 years ago, is still in place, full force.
Mm-hmm.
For example.
Look at the red lines, though.
Yeah.
Look at so is this a case where the people are going through going, yeah, I guess that would be okay, and I guess that would be okay, and I guess that would be okay. Are you okay with providing individual location data on your phones, and now all of a sudden it's like, whoa, no.
I
No.
have a reason for that. I think
All of a sudden Canadians are all about privacy.
Yeah, no. This is about us versus others. This is about me versus the other. So most of the other questions relate to, they ask, should other people be, should police be able to go into other people's homes without a warrant? Should other people be separated from their families? Should other people be subject to vehicular checkpoints and pedestrian checkpoints? But this one is, do you want your government to know where you are at all times?
Yeah.
following your cell phone? And I think that this particular question hits a person, very close to the heart. And I'm not surprised by what I see here. I'm encouraged by what I see here, frankly. Do you think my theory might be on the point?
No, I think you're right. This is something that people can understand. And so when you ask a question about what if somebody's breaking the, restrictions or breaking the mitigation efforts, like, do you think they should be isolated for the duration of and somebody that's a critical thinker that's looking at that logically all the way through is like, oh no, 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 no. That's we're going down a wrong road there. But people
Mhm.
hear it and they're like, yeah, yeah, no, throw the book at them. I mean, people
Yeah,
need to
throw the
get on
book.
board with this whole COVID thing. We need to get rid of it. But then
Yeah.
when you ask a question like this, more specific, that I mean, now all of a sudden that phone's in their pocket, right?
Hmm.
Or against their ear, I guess, when they're responding to this survey,
Yeah.
and they're like, well, wait a minute, no, I don't know.
Hmm.
I want my privacy, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, those other
But
things, taking you out of your
37%.
home and stopping you in your car and stopping you on the street and separating you from your family and putting you in isolation, all of those things are privacy issues as well.
Yeah,
But
they
it's
are.
just not, yeah, just not thinking
It doesn't hit home as clearly as this one does. But
as it does. Yeah, no,
37% of Canadian voters, they do support such actions, and that's interesting because that's about the number of support needed in an election to make a majority government in this country.
mm,
Right? If you get about 37% of the popular vote, it's a pretty good chance that you're forming
yeah,
either a minority or a majority government. So I find that interesting. Um, Across the regions, I don't find anything terribly interesting here. I'll
same
fast forward
story.
here
Yeah,
to the ballot
yeah.
test. Do we see a discrepancy here? 46%. So the red bar is the highest in, look at that, the Conservative Party and the Green Party voters,
Yeah.
and among those who refused to answer. So, this is clearly a group that respects their privacy and wants their privacy respected. But this one here surprised me to see that the people who said they would vote Green Party um, are strongly opposed to this. Any theories why?
No, I mean, no. That is kind of interesting. You wouldn't think it would fall quite that way, you know. But
I wonder if, so what we're seeing is that maybe this is a real difference between why people choose to vote Green instead of NDP.
yeah,
Uh, do Green Party voters perhaps harvest a general distrust of government? Do they respect their privacy more? I don't know. These would be
mm,
interesting answers to get. 59, okay, the question, do you support or oppose fining or jailing those who spread disinformation about COVID-19? For instance, questioning the existence or seriousness of COVID-19, i.e., it's just the flu, quote, end quote.
are,
Can you believe across Canada, 59% support the idea that if I say COVID-19 is, if I repeat what many medical professionals in Canada have said, 59% of Canadians think I should be fined or sent to jail.
how how does the same group of respondents who just clearly understood the problem with the invasion of privacy about the cell phone issue
Mm-hmm.
flip around and ostensibly they ask the questions in this order on the phone call, and the very next question they're like, oh yeah, oh yeah, throw the book.
Yeah, I know. I think it's this phrase. I think that phrase has been politicized to the point that it's one of those, what's the word, dog whistles, or it's a signal that if someone's willing to say that, well, then they must be a Trump supporter.
Okay, Canadians, I'm gonna stretch and be charitable even on this one and say this is just another example of you trying to be team players, but you're making it extremely difficult. That's patently ridiculous to me. I mean that.
Yeah.
Oh man, I
Yeah.
spent the last 7 months like trying to suppress and even out my guttural reactions to stupidity, but that is patently stupid
It's a weird
for
it's a
something you
weird
say.
phenomenon. Yeah, for something you say, you should be sent to jail.
I mean, I guess
And okay, but maybe there's some nuance again we're missing. Like, so what if, okay, if the same person asked who was asked this question and said yes, throw the book at them. If that same person was asked, well, what if the person who said that it's just the flu was a medical doctor? You know, what if the person who said that was a virologist? What if the person who said that was, a, you know, an 18-year-old on Twitter?
you know what
So
it's
yeah, what if it was said on Twitter? What if it was said in a public square with a microphone at a protest? What if it was said, like, in what context are we
you know what
examining everybody's speech and
yeah,
then sending them to jail?
like what's happening so clearly here, and maybe that's as much of the switch as anything. Here we have a super terrible instance of an undefined they, those who spread disinformation. The way that that's worded, the cell phone question is easy to bring back to yourself and say, I don't want to be tracked. But what about those other people, those who spread disinformation? You know, and
Okay,
maybe the
you know,
question elicits ideas of some criminal mastermind who's, you know, trying to suppress the seriousness of the pandemic or something, you know, systematically
it
or whatever.
absolutely
But
does. And that phrase is used over and over by our current government. I would argue it is a propagandist tactic to cast, like you said, those who are willing to play along and those who are not. And those who are not willing to play along, this is just the sort of thing they say. And the other phrase that is demonized in current Canadian mainstream media is, like, if you dare to mention the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you are, well, there's just almost nothing worse than that in Canadian media right now. Whereas, I forget who it was, maybe someone you posted or you shared, or it was in a group that it was in the group with Anthony Davies, I think, where someone had posted this idea that, like, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms should be like middle C on the piano. It's right down the middle of the road, right? It's that yellow line on the pavement where, but all of a sudden in the current zeitgeist, even to mention that phrase seems to cast you as some sort of far right extremist, which is, I just don't understand how that has happened. And I don't know how we come back from that.
well,
But
the
I think
same
that's
thing
at play
here. I
here.
mean, if you know, a constitutionalist here in this country, I would say most people would think that's a far right extremist.
That's somehow not the same, though. For example, I watched an interview not long ago. It's in my memory. It can't be that long ago, with Richard Dreyfuss, who was in an interview very clearly saying, I'm a constitutionalist. And I was shocked because I hadn't heard the term, actually. I don't quite know what that means or what it is, but it seems to me that if you openly admit to supporting the Constitution of the United States, again, that's like saying, I enjoy middle C on a piano. It's in the middle between those,
It should
all
be,
the,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's right there in the, given the Constitution, we can veer, you know, this way and that, and we have issues on either side, but we should all meet at that point. We should all be able to agree on that document. And if we don't agree on that document, well, then we don't agree fundamentally with the structure of the country, and we are seeing that, I think. Sorry, I'm getting way off on a tangent, but I'm shocked by seeing this. And
So this is a
I
good,
know our government is using it, using these numbers here to support and give momentum to, I think it's Bill C-10 or 11, which is specifically regarding the censorship of mainstream, and social media.
so this is a good segue. That's something I wanted to share just quickly. So recall in your mind the thoughts, the feelings, especially and the sentiments that you had back in February or March of last year.
Yeah. Okay.
And talking about, 10 days to slow the spread, 2 weeks to do this, maybe a month of that, and et cetera. And,
Yeah.
and, in your mind was like, well, but what if 2 weeks, 1 month turns into a year, and, and all those unknowns and everything. So here we are, it's turned into a year. And whether you predicted that or not, or
There's no
knew
end
that
in
would
sight.
happen or not, or whatever, here we are.
Yeah.
This is from today at CNN.com. And they're talking about, this is the headline, I've had my COVID-19 vaccine. Now, what can I safely do? And they're giving you basically a frequently asked questions about, what am I allowed to do now that I've been vaccinated? It says, can I please stop wearing a face mask? Let's face it, the answer is no. Try to think of a face mask as your new best friend, one that you plan to cherish and appreciate for a good long time. Here are 5 reasons why. It's not 100% protection, meaning the vaccine. The vaccine only protects 95, is only 95% effective. And then they go on to compare that to birth control. Birth control is only about 95% effective. So would you want to get pregnant, and so you still have to use some sort of protection. I'm not sure why it's, if you have a 95% effective rate on birth control, it means 5% of the time you get pregnant. In this case, it may be 5% of the time you get a disease that has a 0.0 or a 0.8% chance of taking your life, or a 5% chance of serious complications. Anyway, everyone's different. The vaccination might not work for everybody. You could be a silent spreader, and they recount the story of Typhoid Mary.
Oh gosh.
And
Again, typhoid
they mention, they
compared
say
to COVID.
Malone contaminated at least 100 and, well, let me go back. She was an Irish immigrant who worked as a cook for New York families and refused to believe she was asymptomatic. She was an asymptomatic conduit for typhoid fever because she remained healthy. Refusing to cooperate with authorities, Malone contaminated at least 122 people in the 1880s, leaving 5 dead before she was caught and quarantined twice for a total of 26 years. I don't know what that has to do. And then it says, number 5, you don't know whether immunity will
That's the
last.
1880s with a 5% fatality rate, just based on the numbers you said, 5 out of 120? 5 out of
120, yeah.
So a 4.2%, whatever.
Well, I guess out of those that she infected.
I can't do the math that fast, but it's,
yeah.
that is, by all statistics, that is at least 4 times more deadly than COVID. In the 1880s, when they didn't even have you know, an understanding of germs, germ theory, virus. Uh,
It's just it's
doctors,
just an yeah.
physicians
It
didn't even wash their hands before a surgery
yeah.
in those days. Like to compare those time frames are
And to
totally irresponsible
basically
in my opinion.
insinuate that anybody that isn't complying with this new reality is a typhoid Mary.
And just by the way, I don't think it should be illegal for CNN to say such things, to spread such misinformation. I don't think it should be illegal for that. But likewise, I don't think it should be illegal for a Canadian to make reasonable comparisons between COVID-19 and influenza
Hmm.
and
Well,
talk about the relative severity and just talk about the fact that these two things, just given their known rates of fatality today, are both completely different than typhoid, completely different than Ebola, completely different than, you see where I'm going with this? We should be able
yeah.
to make this comparison and not be thrown in jail.
Well, here's the rest of our new reality. When can I
Okay.
hang out with my friends and family?
Yeah.
That depends on everyone's vaccine status, experts say. If friends or
Right.
other members of your family have also received both doses of the COVID-19 vaccine, the risk is greatly reduced, especially if the visit is outdoors. It's probably pretty safe to see others who are also vaccinated after everyone gets both doses and waits a few weeks. It would also be safe if the unvaccinated friends or family members or friends quarantined for 10 days before the outdoor get together. However,
Is
if
there
the
any
visit is
science?
indoors, there's going to be some level of risk.
Is there any science to back up what they're saying here? To 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 create that level of fear
That's
is just.
I mean we
And by the
talk a
way,
lot about the
could they not use the phrases like people who have been vaccinated or have had the actual virus? Because presumably actually having experienced this virus and falling ill to it and then recovering has also produced some level of protection, right? So why
yeah.
the intense hyper focus on people who've been vaccinated? Steve, you've had COVID.
Well,
That is, by all accounts, and I'm not a doctor, so I'm not a doctor, but I'm going to say, it seems to me that's as good or better for you individually. Your body has recovered from it. It's developed some resistance, maybe. I don't know. At
well,
least
and
as effective as what we're
if
seeing
I understand
the
correctly,
vaccination.
most of the like I don't want to go on that whole aside, but it seems like potentially I have actual immunity versus someone who gets a vaccine simply has a boosted immune system that is better prepared to handle COVID when COVID hits them
Yeah.
versus someone who's had COVID and their body's actually, you know, but I
Right.
don't know all of the
Well, no, we
details of
do know.
that.
We know enough from, for
Yeah,
example, our conversation with Todd Miller,
yeah,
that that vaccinations are part of the strategy to develop herd immunity,
yep,
and another part of that strategy is natural endemic spread, and
yep.
yeah. Oh, what else? Do carry on.
Well, I mean, it goes on and it talks
But you
about,
can tell that CNN
don't,
is clearly priming their audience to be obedient,
yeah.
to carry on with this hygiene
And
theater.
I mean, that's not my point is to say, CNN is wanting everybody to march in lockstep or whatever. But my point is when you go back in your own personal thoughts 12 months ago, as
Mm.
all of this was just coming to, you know, to light and it was, you know, complete I mean, just all kinds of varying information and everything. And then as it started to get a little more clear, and back in March and April, thinking, what do I want to be like in a year? What am I prepared for society to turn into in 1 year? And and we know, I mean, the 1918, it was 2.5 or 3 or 4 years or whatever of before it really went away. And but the idea that here we are a year into it with,
It
some
didn't
would
go
say, a
away.
miraculous, what?
It didn't go away. It there were variants
Right. But we got
which
to, I mean, the
no, but I
the
think that's important. That
yeah.
like this idea that this is going to go away is
No,
part of the
that is a really
insanity.
important, yeah, that's a very important point
This
because
isn't going to go away. There will be less dangerous variants 3 years from now than there are now.
yeah.
That's by all accounts, that's how viruses work. That's how we will get through this. That's
If
how
we
we got through the Spanish flu. That's why there's still something called H1N1 and all of its variants that still travel through the human population. This Spanish flu was the first of the H1N1 strands or variants. That's all it was.
we had a really bad year. A lot of people
Yeah,
died from this
yeah.
disease. A lot of people got taken by this virus. But the question we need to, the critical thinking question, which I would posit that not many people giving answers in this survey were thinking through, is what's it going to take? When we can demonstrate statistically that, a year from now, 2 years from now, or whatever, that my personal statistical danger of COVID is now about half or 10% of what my personal danger is regarding the flu or the common cold. Is that, at that point, are we going to stop, or do we see a diminishment of this kind of news story, and all of a sudden it's COVID's just gone and it's not on the radar anymore because we've achieved enough immunity and enough reliable vaccinations or whatever, that now we're at the point where, like, we're good? Because that's not what I'm hearing. What I keep hearing is, well, yes, you could both have the vaccines, you could wait a few weeks, you could make sure you meet outdoors, but if you go indoors, you're still, increasing the chance. And it's like, increasing the chance to what? Increasing it from 0 to 1 in a million to, and
Yeah, yeah.
there's the chance of getting it. There's the chance of getting seriously ill. There's the chance of dying. There's all these chances. I mean, we
Yeah.
take chances when we go out our door every day. And so who's measuring? Who's measuring to say, we've
Well,
crossed the
nobody
finish
is
line
measuring that.
and we are no
Let me
longer
answer part of your.
considering stopping you in your cars, stopping you on the street, forcing you to be vaccinated, forcing you to be isolated, not allowing you to travel.
Yeah,
Like, when?
yeah,
What statistical measure? Because it has to be a statistical measure, because like you alluded to, it certainly shouldn't be and cannot be the idea that COVID is gone and eradicated,
right.
because it's a coronavirus that, with variants developing and mutating,
Yeah,
it's not going to be gone. But
right.
when do we
So
know that we've
let
got
me.
enough of a handle to consider it an acceptable risk again?
There's
Oh,
a
it's
guest that I've been trying to get a guest on our show, a strong advocate of this concept called COVID zero. And I really want to talk with such a person and learn from their perspective. But let me answer one of your questions about this CNN article. You said, when will we stop seeing news articles like this? And I think the answer to that is very clear. When it's no longer profitable for them. And I think that's a secondary or separate issue from all of the other matters around risk due to COVID. A year ago, I like where you're going with this train of thought, by the way. If you put yourself back in your shoes, your own shoes in February or March of last year, what were you prepared to do or give up in order to play with, go along with everyone to flatten the curve and get through this. And I'm reminded, though, that back in that time frame, we were being informed like that the fatality rate was 3.8% or higher, that it had this incredible spread. We were seeing body bags on the news in Italy and in Spain, which we now are hearing that actually some of that, not all, but some of that was caused because those doctors had been given information that they need to get people on ventilators, and they need to give them 1,600 or whatever milligrams of hydroxychloroquine, or I can't even pronounce the darn name. And now looking back, I'm watching plenty of YouTube videos with plenty of good experts out there that are analyzing that past, saying that the treatment was maybe rushed or inappropriate. They may have caused some of those deaths by putting people on ventilators too early, but that was the advice coming out of the Wuhan area at the time, and so on and so on, right? Like the information we were getting back then was that this is really bad. And I'm wondering, though, that some of the people watching the mainstream news media haven't been informed that it's nowhere near that bad. It's not 3.8%. It's somewhere in that range for people who are 80 years old or older that have all these comorbidities. But for people 79 and younger, not 3.8. Nowhere near 3.8%. But if you're still thinking in terms of 3.8% fatality rate, massive spread, we don't have any treatments, people go on ventilators and they never come back from it because everyone remembers Cuomo saying that, they're seeing these articles from CNN and they still believe it. And they still think that that's the extent of restrictions that we need. And those are the measures that everyone has to take. And if they're not willing to take those measures, well, then they need to be locked up and put in isolation centers. So some of this that we're seeing in the survey, I think is a matter of, like there's a category of dispute at play where some people, everyone has been exposed to different information. And if we could all just see the same information, we might all come to some congruence, like not total unanimity, but more.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, more transparent information would be great. We're not politicians and we're not monarchs, and we cannot pull those levers of you will do this and mandate that and suggest this and whatever. But as individuals, I think everyone needs to think somewhat seriously about this topic and say how much risk is worth how much mitigation. I wrote a recent blog, or my most recent one was about trying to put that on the scale in totality. Here's all the deaths and all of the fallout versus all of the fallout of the mitigation efforts. But I think the important thing is for each of us to put it on the scale for ourselves and say, I'm willing, given this much risk, to have this much of my personal freedoms or personal choice curtailed. And this is the balance for me. And if the risk doesn't increase significantly, or as the risk decreases, then I expect to have less curtailment of my personal choice and personal freedom. And if no one is making that assessment personally, and that may be somewhat fluid as information changes and as situations change and you have different personal experiences and you lose loved ones due to COVID. And I mean, that equation may change for you, but to not have an equation in your mind at all is to say, I want to be a team player. they say it's pretty bad. And so I guess I'll go along with what they say until it gets better. And it's like, how bad is bad and how better is better? And if you're not thinking about those things, then who will there be to kind of stick their foot in the sand and say, no, 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 no. COVID is over. As far as the pandemic and the seriousness of it, that's been mitigated, and it is now much less of a risk, and it's time to reopen these things and let me go and do these things and let me travel freely again, etc. I mean, because if we don't, then this lemming mentality can happen. And that is so far in my mind from being conspiratorial or right-wing nut or anything else. It's simply saying, I've got a personal responsibility to measure that for myself and decide at what point I'm going to bristle or disobey or be dissident to the laws, the mandates, the whatever's going on. It's such an interesting and difficult
I think
topic.
you've hit something. You've hit the nail on the head there. It makes me think back to myself as a younger person, and it's easy to be absolutist. It's really easy to hear a question like, should we set aside mobility rights? Should we put barricades at the provincial borders and not let people across the border in order to stop the spread? And it's easy to say, yeah, we should absolutely do that, and not make the same equation that you're talking about. Because the equation as an absolutist is, well, we're talking about the others. I mean, of course, I'm not affected by that. Yes, we should stop people at the border and not let them across. Because I have no plans on going across the border, right? But, and there are plenty of other examples of that, I think. Yeah, it's okay that businesses are bankrupt and people are foreclosing on their home. I still have my home, and I don't, I'm a student in university, so I wasn't planning on getting a job this year anyways. The unemployment rate is rising, the debt is increasing. Well, it's not my debt, it's the others. It's always, like, as an absolutist, I can take such strong stance, and knowing that I really don't have much I'm not going to lose. This equation you're talking about doesn't affect me. I'm like an externality in the whole equation as an absolutist. A little bit like the way, the way that leaders of a fringe political party can basically go out into the public and say anything, because there's nothing for them to lose. We're seeing this in politics all around us, where leaders of fringe parties will, like, essentially they're like a full-time protest party, and they sorry, I'm using the they undefined. Let me be more specific. No, I don't need to have an analogy or a story for that, but I think you get where I'm coming from. As an absolutist, I can always think, yes, absolutely, we should curtail everybody's freedoms, and I won't mind either. But in the back of my mind, I'm not actually confronted with the consequence of that.
Unless you're talking about your cell phone, which you can absolutely understand, and all of a sudden the numbers change like crazy.
Which is why we saw that. Let's go back to that, or not to that slide exactly, but I didn't mean to change the position.
David,
Yes.
Can I interrupt? We are 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Okay, well, let's carry on and quick or stop. Do you want to stop now, or do you want to just quickly?
No,
read
maybe
the
let's
next...
just wrap up. There's just a couple more questions, right?
Yeah. Do you support or oppose the government suspending civil liberties and rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms for the duration of the pandemic?
Well, there's a little bit of glimmer of hope there.
Yeah, little bit.
Suspending civil liberties and rights.
Yeah. However,
What a
let's look
horrible
at
blanket statement.
how that breaks down across party affiliation. The highest support for this is the Liberal Party voters. Yeah. And then we've seen these last pages here, which are the breakdown
Way
of
the numbers break down.
party affiliation. Okay, so let me stop and bring this back. Steve, it's just so nice to talk with someone about this, because I've been just distraught, I suppose, seeing these numbers and not knowing what to make of it. I think you're onto something. Like, if there's any hope here, it's that, as you say, as we kind of identified here in the question about cell phone tracking, that when people are really confronted with a concrete example of how it affects them personally and locally, they're much more resistant to infringement.
Well, thanks, David. I agree. I'm grateful to have the time to chat with you. Grateful to anyone who's made it. Now, I'll tell you what, if there's somebody out there who has watched all hour and 48 minutes of this
Now we're 46.
broadcast, whether live or you sit through an entire rebroadcast of this conversation, please message or email me. Go to fundamentalfreedoms.org and get a message off to us through Locals or Facebook, and I will send you a valuable prize if you can. I know that could bankrupt me, but yeah, I really want to recognize anyone who's taking the time to share in these conversations and stick it out with us. We hope we're doing some good. I hope that, it's doing good for me. If nothing else,
Yeah.
this is catharsis for David and I guess. But I think these conversations need to happen. And in light of some of the things that are going on, some of the political and legislative creep that we see going on, and in light of the divisiveness that's happening. Unfortunately, it's hard work and it's time consuming, but this is the antidote, in my opinion. But I'll give you the last word, David.
Well, thanks, Steve. Good night to you. It's nice to talk with you again. I've been trying to reach out to people and line up some future guests. I know you have too, and we've got some really interesting irons in the fire. For anyone listening, if you want to talk with us, or you know someone that you think we should reach out to, let us know that. One of the things Steve and I have said repeatedly is that the guests we've had so far have tended to be folks that we have a lot of common ground with, and that's not the entire purpose of our little podcast. We hope to have lots of good discussion with people with whom we have very little common ground, so that we can understand broader perspectives. So keep that in mind. Find us at fundamentalfreedoms.org. We have put a website there. We'll continue to develop that website so that, for example, right now Steve has published some blog articles there. Steve, I've only read the first one, so I'm behind. I need to catch up. And by the way, that first article that Steve wrote, I forget the new title. The new title?
Yeah, well, pulling. Something about pulling. The harder we pull, that is the title. The harder
we pull. Great allegory. And we're also going to put some information there about how to find all of our videos and all the various platforms that we want to publish our videos. Rumble and YouTube and Facebook for now, maybe others. But also, a couple of people have asked, how might they support us? Give us a little financial donation. And we're figuring that out, actually. The only avenue for that right now would be like an email money transfer to our email address, if you know it, or at locals.com, if you are signed up there. Locals provides an option for you to become a supporter, and for as little as $3 a month, for example, you can subscribe. But we're exploring some options there, and we'll post that at the website as well.
We're going to need that support when the flood of responses come in, and I owe all these valuable prizes for the people who made it through this cast. So
yeah. So Steve, I remember at the beginning I did say that we would look at the chats and see if any, and I've, as predicted, I have not even looked. Sorry, it's not going to happen tonight. So
I've been watching. Not a lot of activity.
Okay, well, good, because we wouldn't have noticed it. I wouldn't have noticed it anyways. Have a great night, Steve. Good to see you again.
Yep. Thank you. Good night.
Take care.